Blood spattered across the weathered wood of the Rusty Nail Saloon as Ethan Ingram slammed his fist into the jaw of a man who'd called him yellow. The crowded room fell silent as the insulter dropped to the floor, leaving Ethan standing alone, his knuckles raw and his reputation intact. No one called him a coward, not after Antelope Ridge, not after what he'd survived. The year was 1875, and Whispering Pines, Wyoming territory, was still young enough that a man's honor was everything. Ethan flexed his throbbing hand and surveyed the room. The piano player resumed his tinny melody, and the patrons returned to their drinks and card games, careful not to meet his eyes. "Get him out of here," the bartender called, nodding toward the unconscious man. Two cowboys dragged the man outside while Ethan retreated to an empty table in the corner. He wasn't proud of what he'd done, but in a place like this, reputation was survival. He settled into his seat, his tall frame casting a shadow across the worn table as he stared at nothing in particular, lost in thoughts he wished would leave him be. His dark hair hung just above his shoulders, and his beard was neatly trimmed despite the trail dust that seemed permanently embedded in his clothes. At 32, the lines around his eyes told stories of hardship that his tight-lipped demeanor rarely shared. The saloon door swung open, bringing with it a gust of autumn wind. A woman stood framed in the doorway, her presence unusual for this establishment at this hour. She wore a simple dress, practical but neat, her auburn hair pinned back in a no-nonsense bun. Her eyes scanned the room with purpose until they landed on Ethan. Delilah Jenkins was not easily intimidated. At 28, she'd survived the loss of her family during the war, a failed marriage to a drunkard, and the struggle of establishing herself in a town that viewed a woman in business with suspicion. The small eatery she'd opened 6 months ago was finally turning a profit, but only because she worked from dawn until well past dusk. She carried a steaming bowl across the room, ignoring the whispers and stares that followed her. Without invitation, she placed the soup in front of Ethan and pulled out the chair opposite him. "You haven't eaten in 3 days," she said matter-of-factly. Ethan looked up, his blue eyes narrowing. "Been counting, have you? My window faces the street. You pass by, but you never come in." She folded her hands on the table. "I figured if you wouldn't come to the food would come to you." The rich aroma of beef and vegetables rose from the bowl, reminding Ethan just how long it had been since he'd had a proper meal. His stomach growled traitorously. "I didn't ask for charity," he said, even as his hand reached for the spoon. "It's not charity. First bowl's free for new customers." A smile touched her lips. "Business strategy." He grunted and took a spoonful, the flavor exploding in his mouth. It was good, better than good. Ethan hadn't tasted cooking like this since before the war. "I'm Delilah Jenkins," she said. "I own the eatery down the street. I know who you are." He took another spoonful, avoiding her gaze. "And you're Ethan Ingram." When he looked up, surprised, she added, "Small town, word gets around." "What else does word say?" He couldn't keep the edge from his voice. "That you rode with Colonel Thornton's men, that you were at Antelope Ridge," she paused. "That you're the only one who came back." His hand tightened on the spoon. "Word talks too much." Delilah didn't flinch from his hard stare. "Word also says you're looking for steady work. I need someone to repair my roof before winter hits." Ethan resumed eating, considering her words. He'd been taking odd jobs since arriving in Whispering Pines 3 weeks ago, enough to pay for his room at the boarding house and the occasional whiskey, but not much more. Winter in Wyoming was brutal, and his funds wouldn't last. "I'm not a handyman," he finally said. "Can you hammer a nail?" "Yes." "Can you saw a board straight?" He nodded. "Then you're qualified." She stood, smoothing her apron. "Come by tomorrow morning if you're interested. I can pay fair wages and provide lunch." Before he could respond, she turned and walked away, her back straight, her steps purposeful. The saloon patrons watched her go, and more than a few curious glances shifted to Ethan afterward. He finished the soup in silence, aware that something had just changed, though he couldn't say what. The warmth in his belly wasn't just from the food. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Ethan stood outside Delilah's eatery, a modest building with Jenkins' home kitchen painted in neat letters across the front window. The smell of fresh bread and coffee drifted through the cracks around the door, and his stomach reminded him that he hadn't eaten since the soup the night before. He knocked, and moments later Delilah appeared. Her hair was coming loose from its pins, her cheeks flushed from the heat of the kitchen. "You came," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "You offered work," he replied simply. The interior was clean and welcoming, 5 tables covered with checkered cloths, a counter with stools, and a doorway that presumably led to the kitchen. 2 older men sat at one table, nursing coffee cups and eyeing Ethan with open curiosity. "That's Mr. Holbrook and Mr. Preston," Delilah explained. "They're here every morning at dawn." Ethan nodded to the men, who returned the gesture cautiously. "Have you eaten?" Delilah asked, already moving toward the kitchen. "I'm fine." That wasn't the question. She disappeared through the doorway, returning moments later with a plate of eggs, bacon, and biscuits. "Eat first. Work second." Ethan wanted to refuse. He didn't like feeling obligated, but the food looked too good to pass up. He sat at the counter and ate while Delilah tended to her other customers, refilling their coffee and chatting easily. "Miss Delilah," Mr. Preston called, "you sure about hiring this fella? I could send my boy over to fix that roof." Delilah smiled. "Your son has enough work at the mill, Mr. Preston. Besides, Mr. Ingram and I have already come to an arrangement." Mr. Holbrook leaned over to whisper something to his companion, both men casting sideways glances at Ethan. "Don't mind them," Delilah said quietly when she returned to the counter. "They're protective." "Of you or your business?" Ethan asked between bites. "Both, I suppose. When I first opened, they were the only ones who would eat here regularly." A woman-owned business isn't common, especially one that competes with the hotel restaurant. Ethan considered this as he finished his meal. "The roof, how bad is it?" "There's a leak in the back corner of the kitchen. With the snow coming, I'm worried it'll get worse." After breakfast, Delilah led him outside and around to the back of the building. A ladder was already propped against the wall, and nearby a stack of wooden shingles waited. "I ordered these last week," she explained. "The general store delivered them, but their handyman is backed up with work until after the first snow." Ethan removed his coat and rolled up his sleeves. "I'll need a hammer and some nails. In the shed," she pointed to a small structure beside the building. "Everything should be in there." "I have to get back inside. Lunchtime rush will start soon, but I'll bring you something to drink in a while." He watched her go, noticing how she moved with efficiency and purpose, no motion wasted. It was the way of someone who had learned to rely solely on themselves. The work was straightforward enough. Ethan climbed onto the roof to assess the damage, finding several worn and broken shingles around a small hole that had been letting in water. He set about replacing them methodically, the physical labor a welcome distraction from the thoughts that usually plagued him. By midday, the sun was high, and sweat trickled down Ethan's back despite the cool air. He was nearly finished when Delilah appeared below with a tin cup. "Water," she called up. He climbed down, suddenly aware of how thirsty he was. The water was cool and sweet, and he drank it in long gulps while Delilah watched. "You've made good progress," she observed. Ethan nodded. "Should be done before sundown. In that case, you've earned lunch." She gestured toward the kitchen door. "I made stew." "You don't have to feed me as part of the job." Delilah's expression was unreadable. "Food is what I do, Mr. Ingram. Consider it part of your wages if it makes you feel better." Inside, the eatery was busy with tradesmen and shopkeepers taking their midday meal. Conversation dimmed momentarily when Ethan entered, his presence drawing attention before the patrons returned to their food and gossip. Delilah led him to a small table in the corner, away from the other diners. "Wait here," she instructed before disappearing into the kitchen. She returned with a large bowl of beef stew and a thick slice of bread. "Eat," she said, and it wasn't a suggestion. The stew was rich and hearty, the meat tender, the vegetables perfectly cooked. Ethan couldn't remember the last time he'd had two such good meals in a row. "This is good," he said between mouthfuls. Delilah's smile was small but genuine. "Thank you. My grandmother taught me to cook. She always said food should feed the soul as well as the body." She was right. A comfortable silence fell between them as Ethan continued eating. He observed Delilah as she moved around the room, refilling coffee cups, taking orders, and exchanging pleasantries with her customers. There was an ease to her interactions that Ethan envied. Since the war, since Antelope Ridge, he found it difficult to engage in casual conversation. "Miss Jenkins," a voice called from the doorway. Ethan looked up to see Sheriff Thomas Miller standing just inside the entrance, his badge gleaming on his chest. The lawman's eyes swept the room, landing on Ethan with a flicker of recognition. "Sheriff," Delilah greeted him. "What can I get you today?" "Just coffee for now, thank you." Miller moved to the counter, his gaze periodically returning to Ethan. Delilah brought the sheriff his coffee and leaned against the counter, speaking to him in a low voice. Ethan couldn't hear what was said, but he saw the lawman nod and glance his way once more. When Delilah returned to collect Ethan's empty bowl, he asked, "Problem with the sheriff?" She shook her head. "No problem, he stops by most days." She hesitated. "He did ask about you, and what did you tell him?" "That I hired you to fix my roof." She met his eyes. "Is there something else I should know?" Ethan stood, pushing back from the table. "No, I should get back to work." Outside, the air felt good against his skin. He climbed back onto the roof and resumed his task, but his mind was elsewhere. Sheriff Miller's interest wasn't surprising. A new face in a small town always drew attention, especially one with a reputation. Ethan had done nothing illegal in Whispering Pines, but his past had a way of following him. By late afternoon, the roof was finished. Ethan gathered his tools and climbed down to find Delilah waiting for him. "All done," he said, wiping his hands on his trousers. She looked up at the roof, shielding her eyes from the sun. "Thank you, it looks good. It'll hold through winter now." Delilah reached into her pocket and pulled out a small pouch, counting out several coins. "This is what we agreed on." Ethan took the money, feeling the weight of it in his palm. It wasn't much, but it was fair for a day's work. "If you're looking for more work," she added, "I could use help with some other repairs. The back step is rotting and one of the window frames needs to be replaced." He considered her offer. The boarding house where he stayed was impersonal and lonely, and the saloon offered little beyond temporary oblivion. This place, with its good food and straightforward tasks, held an appeal he hadn't anticipated. "I could come back tomorrow," he said finally. Relief flickered across Delilah's face. "Good, come for breakfast and we can discuss what needs to be done." As Ethan walked back to his room that evening, he found himself thinking about Delilah Jenkins, her quiet competence, her direct manner, and the way her eyes seemed to see through his carefully constructed defenses. It was unsettling, but not entirely unwelcome. For the first time in months, he fell asleep without reaching for the whiskey bottle beside his bed. The next few days established a routine. Ethan would arrive at Jenkins' home kitchen just after sunrise, eat a breakfast that Delilah insisted was part of his wages, and then set to work on whatever repair she had planned for the day. He replaced the back step, fixed the loose window frame, and reinforced shelving in the storage room. During meals, he sat at the corner table, observing the comings and goings of the town through the eatery's windows. Whispering Pines wasn't large, perhaps 500 souls at most, but it was a stop on the stage line and had enough commerce to support itself. The lumber mill at the edge of town provided work for many men, and the surrounding ranches brought cowboys in regularly for supplies. Ethan learned that Delilah had come to Whispering Pines 18 months earlier, after her husband died in a mining accident in Colorado. She never spoke of him with fondness, and Ethan suspected the marriage had not been happy. With the little money she'd saved, she had purchased the small building and converted it into an eatery, living in the rooms upstairs. It wasn't much when I bought it, she told him on the fourth day as they repaired a cabinet in the kitchen. The previous owner used it as a watch repair shop. I had to build the stove and counter myself. You did all this alone? Ethan asked, impressed despite himself. Not entirely. Mrs. Whitaker, she owns the dress shop, let me stay with her until the place was habitable. And Mr. Preston helped me install the stove. People here are kind once they accept you as one of their own. And have they accepted you? Delilah paused, considering. Most have. Some still think a widow should be content to remarry or work for someone else. Sheriff Miller gets complaints occasionally about that woman's establishment taking business from the hotel, but he doesn't act on them, she smiled. He's rather fond of my apple pie. On the fifth day, as Ethan was repairing a broken chair, the bell above the door jingled and 3 cowboys entered. They were trail dusty and loud, clearly fresh off a cattle drive and eager for town comforts. Ethan recognized the type young men with money in their pockets and a desire to forget the hardships of the trail. Well, look at this, the tallest one said, surveying the room. Didn't know this town had such fine dining. Delilah emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. Welcome, gentlemen. Please take a seat wherever you'd like. The 3 men exchanged glances, their grins suggesting they found something amusing. They settled at a table near the center of the room, lounging in their chairs with the exaggerated ease of men who believed themselves impressive. What can I get you? Delilah asked, her professional demeanor unchanged. What's a pretty lady like you doing running a place like this? The tall cowboy asked instead of ordering. No husband to take care of you. I take care of myself just fine, Delilah replied coolly. Now are you here to eat or just to talk? The second cowboy, a stocky man with a weathered face, chuckled. We're here to eat, madam. What's good? Everything, Ethan said from his corner, drawing their attention. The stew especially. The cowboys looked him over, making quick assessments. The tall one nodded slightly, recognizing something in Ethan that gave him pause. 3 bowls of stew, then, the third cowboy said, and coffee. Delilah nodded and returned to the kitchen. The cowboys lowered their voices, occasionally glancing toward Ethan, who continued working on the chair as if he hadn't noticed their interest. When Delilah returned with their food, the tall cowboy reached out and caught her wrist. Say, why don't you join us? Must get lonely in this place. Delilah extracted her wrist from his grip. Enjoy your meal, gentlemen. Her voice was firm, but Ethan saw the tension in her shoulders. The cowboys ate quickly, their earlier bravado tempered by the presence of other diners who had entered the eatery. When they finished, the tall one left money on the table, and they departed with only a few backward glances. Later, after the lunch rush had ended and Ethan was the only customer remaining, Delilah brought him a slice of apple pie. You didn't have to speak up earlier, she said, sitting across from him. I didn't say anything that wasn't true. She studied him for a moment. No, you didn't. She pushed the pie toward him. You've been here almost a week and there's not much left to repair. Ethan felt a twinge of disappointment. The routine had been comfortable, the work satisfying. I suppose I'll be moving on then. Unless, Delilah began, then stopped, seeming to reconsider her words. The eatery gets busy, especially during meal times. I've been thinking of hiring help, but good help is hard to find. Ethan looked up from his pie, surprised. You're offering me a job as what, a cook? She laughed, the sound warm and genuine. No, I don't think either of us is ready for that. But I could use someone to serve tables, wash dishes, maybe handle the early morning preparations. I'm not exactly the friendly sort, he pointed out. You don't need to be friendly, just reliable, she paused. And occasionally intimidating, as you were today. Ethan considered the offer. He had planned to move on once winter passed, perhaps head to Montana or Idaho. But the thought of leaving Whispering Pines, leaving this eatery and its proprietress, was unexpectedly unpleasant. I'll think about it, he said finally. Delilah nodded, standing to return to her work. That's all I ask. That night, lying in his sparse room at the boarding house, Ethan weighed his options. He had enough money saved to last through winter if he was careful, but not much more. The idea of serving food and dealing with customers didn't appeal to him, but the alternative, drifting from town to town, taking whatever work he could find, had lost some of its luster. And then there was Delilah herself. In just a week, she had somehow breached the walls he'd built around himself since Antelope Ridge. Her no-nonsense attitude, her independence, her quiet strength all reminded him of a time when he'd believed in things like home and future. The next morning, he arrived at the eatery earlier than usual. Delilah was already there, her sleeves rolled up as she kneaded dough on the kitchen counter. "Good morning," she said, glancing up briefly. "Breakfast isn't quite ready." "I'll help," Ethan said, removing his coat and hanging it on a peg by the door. "If the offer still stands." Delilah's hands stilled. "It does. Then I accept." A smile spread across her face, transforming her features. For a moment, Ethan glimpsed the woman she might have been before life had taught her caution. "Good," she said simply. "You can start by stoking the stove. We'll need it hot for the biscuits." And just like that, Ethan Ingram, once a soldier and drifter, became an employee of Jenkins' home kitchen. The transition wasn't without challenges. Ethan had to learn the rhythm of the eatery, the preferences of regular customers, and how to balance multiple tasks at once. His taciturn nature initially made some patrons uncomfortable, but they soon grew accustomed to his quiet efficiency. Delilah proved to be a patient teacher, showing him how to brew coffee properly, how to arrange plates for maximum appeal, and how to manage the flow of customers during busy periods. They developed a wordless communication, each anticipating the other's movements in the confined space of the eatery. As October gave way to November, the first snow fell on Whispering Pines. Business at the eatery increased as cold weather drove people indoors, seeking hot meals and warm company. Ethan's days were full, and for the first time in years, he found purpose in the simple acts of service. He moved out of the boarding house and into a small room at the back of the eatery, separated from the kitchen by a sturdy door. The arrangement made sense practically. He could start the fires before dawn and secure the building at night, but it also marked a shift in his relationship with Delilah. They were no longer employer and employee but partners of sorts, each dependent on the other for the success of the business. One evening in late November, after the last customer had departed and the dishes were washed, Delilah and Ethan sat at a table near the stove, drinking coffee and going over the day's earnings. "We did well today," Delilah said, counting the coins and recording the amount in a small ledger. "Better than this time last year. The mining camp that opened north of town is bringing in new customers," Ethan observed. "Those men were talking about more workers arriving next month." Delilah nodded, her forehead creased in thought. "We might need to consider expanding if business continues to grow. The Wilsons are thinking of selling their candy shop next door if we could acquire that space." "You're thinking that far ahead," she looked up, meeting his eyes. "Aren't you?" The question caught him off guard. For years, he had lived day to day, never planning beyond his next meal or bed. The future had been a luxury he couldn't afford, not with the memories of Antelope Ridge always threatening to overwhelm him. "I haven't thought much about it," he admitted. Delilah closed the ledger and studied him. "What happened at Antelope Ridge, Ethan?" His body tensed involuntarily. No one in Whispering Pines had dared ask him directly, though he knew they whispered about it when he passed. "It's not a story fit for telling," he said, his voice rough. "I think it's a story you need to tell." She reached across the table, her hand stopping short of touching his. "I've seen the nightmares, heard you calling out in your sleep. Whatever happened there is still happening to you." Ethan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "Some things are better left buried." Delilah didn't flinch from his sudden movement. "Is that what you've been doing? Burying it? How's that working for you?" He turned away, unable to bear the compassion in her eyes. "I should check the wood supply before turning in." Outside, the night air was bitter cold, the stars sharp points of light in the black sky. Ethan stood in the small yard behind the eatery, his breath forming clouds before him as he tried to regain his composure. Antelope Ridge. Even the name sent ice through his veins. It had been a simple scouting mission Colonel Thornton and 12 men, including Ethan, sent to assess reports of renegade Cheyenne in the area. What they found instead was a small settlement of peaceful tribes, mostly women and children, gathering late autumn berries. What happened next? Ethan closed his eyes, but that only made the memories more vivid. The colonel's orders, the men's hesitation, the first shots, the screams. He had refused to fire, had tried to stop it, but he was just one man. In the end, he'd been knocked unconscious by one of his own comrades. When he awoke, it was over. Everyone was dead, the Native Americans, Colonel Thornton, all the soldiers except Ethan. He never learned who had killed the colonel and the others, whether it was Cheyenne warriors who arrived too late to save their families or perhaps even one of the soldiers, overcome with remorse. Ethan had buried them all, marking each grave with stones before riding away from that blood-soaked ridge, carrying the weight of what he had witnessed. "Ethan," he turned to find Delilah standing in the doorway, a shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I shouldn't have pushed." "No," he said, surprising himself. "Maybe you're right, maybe it needs telling." She stepped closer, her face illuminated by the light spilling from the open door. "Then I'm ready to listen whenever you're ready to speak." That night, sitting by the dying embers of the kitchen stove, Ethan told Delilah everything. The words came haltingly at first, then in a rush, like water breaking through a dam. He spoke of the massacre, of his failed attempt to stop it, of the nightmares that had haunted him since. Delilah listened without interruption, her eyes never leaving his face, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. When he finished, the silence between them was heavy but not uncomfortable. "You tried to stop it," she said finally. "That matters, not to those who died. Perhaps not." She reached for his hand, her touch warm against his cold skin. "But it matters to me." In that moment, something changed between them. The walls Ethan had built began to crumble, and for the first time since Antelope Ridge, he allowed himself to feel something beyond guilt and regret. As winter deepened, so too did the connection between Ethan and Delilah. Their days were filled with work serving meals, ordering supplies, maintaining the eatery against the harsh Wyoming weather. Their evenings were spent in conversation, sharing pieces of their past, building understanding. Ethan learned that Delilah had grown up in Ohio, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a carpenter. Her family had moved west when she was 16, seeking opportunity in the newly established Colorado territory. The war had taken her father and brother, leaving Delilah and her mother to fend for themselves. When her mother fell ill, Delilah had married James Jenkins, a miner with steady work and a promise to care for them both. "He wasn't cruel," Delilah explained one evening as they sat before the fire, "but he was cold. He provided a roof and food, nothing more. When Mother died, he saw no reason to pretend affection." "Why did you stay?" Ethan asked. "Where would I have gone? A woman alone has few options." She stared into the flames. "When the mine collapsed, I felt relief. Isn't that terrible? I mourned him because it seemed the proper thing to do, but mostly I felt free." Ethan understood freedom gained at the cost of others' lives all too well. "There's no shame in surviving," he said softly. Delilah looked up, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "No, there isn't." The town of Whispering Pines took notice of the partnership developing at Jenkins' home kitchen. Some, like Mr. Preston and Mr. Holbrook, watched with approval. Others, particularly the women who had set their sights on Whispering Pines' newest bachelor, were less pleased. Sheriff Miller stopped by more frequently, his gaze assessing as he watched Ethan move about the eatery. One afternoon in early December, he lingered after the other customers had gone, nursing a cup of coffee until Delilah retreated to the kitchen. "Ingram," he said, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. "Sit a spell." Ethan complied, his face betraying nothing of his wariness. "You've settled in well here," the sheriff observed. "Miss Jenkins seems pleased with your work." "I do my best," Miller nodded slowly. "I've been making inquiries about you." Ethan's expression remained neutral, but his body tensed slightly. "Find anything interesting?" "Some. Army records show you served with distinction until 72, honorably discharged after Antelope Ridge." The sheriff paused. "Not much record of what happened there, though. Official reports are incomplete." "What are you asking, Sheriff?" "I'm not asking anything. Just letting you know I've looked into your background, as I do with all newcomers who plan to stay." Miller set his empty cup down. "You should know there's been talk. There always is. Some folks think you and Miss Jenkins are becoming more than business associates." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Her reputation is important to her. Indeed it is. This town respects Miss Jenkins. She's built something valuable here against considerable odds." The sheriff stood, placing coins on the table. It would be a shame if anything or anyone were to jeopardize that. After the sheriff departed, Ethan remained seated, turning the conversation over in his mind. He and Delilah had maintained propriety in all their dealings, but he couldn't deny the growing feelings between them. She had become essential to him, her quiet strength, her resilience, her ability to see through his defenses to the man he once was and might be again. That evening, as snow fell heavily outside, Ethan broached the subject. "Sheriff Miller thinks we're courting," he said as they sat before the fire, the day's work complete. Delilah looked up from her mending, her expression unreadable. "And what did you tell him?" "That your reputation matters." She set her sewing aside. "Is that all that matters?" Ethan met her gaze, seeing the challenge there. "No," he admitted, "but it's not simple, Delilah. I'm not the man you deserve. Shouldn't I be the judge of that?" She moved to sit beside him, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she used. "What are you afraid of, Ethan?" The question struck at the heart of his hesitation. Fear had been his companion for so long, fear of remembering, fear of forgetting, fear of allowing himself to care for someone who might be taken from him, or worse, might eventually see him for what he truly was. "I'm afraid of bringing darkness into your life," he said finally. Delilah's hand found his, her fingers intertwining with his own. "My life has known darkness too. Perhaps that's why we found each other, not to add to that darkness, but to help each other find the light again." Her words, simple and true, broke something open inside him. Without thinking, Ethan leaned forward and kissed her, a gentle meeting of lips that held both question and answer. When they parted, Delilah's eyes were bright with emotion. "I've been waiting for you to do that," she whispered. "I should have done it sooner," she smiled. "Yes, you should have." The kiss changed everything and nothing. Their daily routine continued, rising before dawn to prepare the eatery, serving meals throughout the day, closing up after the supper crowd departed. But now there were stolen moments of tenderness. A brush of hands as they passed each other in the kitchen, a shared smile across the room, quiet evenings spent planning not just for the business but for a future together. They agreed to proceed with propriety. Ethan continued to sleep in the back room, and they were careful to maintain a professional demeanor in front of customers. But within the town, word spread that Ethan Ingram was courting Delilah Jenkins, and the eatery became a place of curiosity for those who wished to observe this unlikely romance. Christmas approached, bringing with it a festive atmosphere to Whispering Pines. The general store displayed colorful goods from back east, and the church organized a pageant featuring the town's children. Delilah decorated the eatery with pine boughs and red ribbons, and she added special items to the menu: gingerbread, mincemeat pie, and roast goose on Christmas Eve. Business boomed as the holiday neared. Miners from the camp north of town came in for hot meals, and families out shopping stopped by for coffee and treats. Ethan found himself working from before sunrise until well after dark, but the exhaustion was satisfying in a way he had never experienced before. On Christmas Eve, after serving a special supper to a packed house, Delilah and Ethan finally closed the doors and sank into chairs by the stove, too tired to speak but content in their shared accomplishment. "We did well," Delilah said after a while, tallying the day's earnings. "Better than I could have hoped." Ethan nodded, watching her in the lamplight. She had worn a red ribbon in her hair for the occasion, and despite the long hours of work, she looked beautiful. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. "It's not much, but—" He handed her a small package wrapped in brown paper. Delilah accepted it with a smile of surprise. "You didn't have to get me anything." "I wanted to." She unwrapped the package carefully, revealing a small wooden box. Inside, nestled on a bed of cotton, was a silver hairpin topped with a delicate carving of a bird in flight. "Ethan, it's beautiful," she whispered, running her finger over the intricate work. "Mr. Chen at the laundry helped me find it. His cousin is a silversmith in San Francisco." Ethan felt uncharacteristically nervous. "Do you truly like it?" "I love it." She removed the red ribbon from her hair and replaced it with the silver pin. "How does it look?" "Perfect," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Delilah reached beneath the counter and produced a package of her own, wrapped in red paper. "I have something for you too." Ethan unwrapped it slowly, revealing a leather-bound journal and a fine fountain pen. "I've noticed you writing sometimes on scraps of paper," she explained. "I thought you might like somewhere proper to put your thoughts." He was touched by her thoughtfulness, by the fact that she had observed this private habit of his. Since Antelope Ridge, he had found solace in writing not a formal journal, but fragments of memory and reflection, a way of making sense of his experiences. "Thank you," he said, running his hand over the smooth leather cover. "This means a great deal to me. Merry Christmas, Ethan." "Merry Christmas, Delilah." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the fire and reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment, from a silent cowboy at an empty table and a determined woman with a bowl of soup, to two people building a life together. Outside, snow fell gently on whispering pines, covering the town in a blanket of white that promised a fresh beginning. As winter gave way to spring, Ethan and Delilah's relationship deepened. Their courtship, conducted under the watchful eyes of the town, was a source of gossip but increasingly of approval as well. Ethan's quiet strength and evident devotion to Delilah won over even the most skeptical observers. The eatery continued to thrive. With the melting of the snow, travelers returned to the roads, and Whispering Pines saw an influx of newcomers, miners, settlers, and businessmen drawn by the region's opportunities. Jenkins' home kitchen became known not just for its good food, but as a place where information was exchanged, deals were made, and community was formed. Ethan found himself drawn into the life of the town in ways he had never anticipated. He joined the volunteer fire brigade, helped construct a new schoolhouse, and even reluctantly agreed to teach some of the older boys basic marksmanship at the sheriff's request. "You're becoming respectable," Delilah teased him one evening as they walked back from a town meeting. "A dangerous development," he replied with a rare smile. "Terrifying," she agreed, slipping her hand into his. "Next thing you know, you'll be running for town council." Ethan snorted at the absurdity of the suggestion, but he couldn't deny that Whispering Pines had become home in a way no place had been since before the war. He had friends here, real friends, not just drinking companions or temporary allies. He had purpose in his work at the eatery and in his relationship with Delilah, and he had begun to heal. The nightmares came less frequently now, and when they did, Delilah was there, her presence a comfort in the dark hours. In April, they purchased the candy shop next door, using their combined savings and a small loan from the bank. The expansion allowed them to serve more customers and to add a private dining room that could be reserved for special occasions. The work of renovating the space kept them both busy, but it was a shared labor that strengthened their bond. One evening, as they surveyed the nearly completed dining room, Ethan found himself thinking about the future in a way he had not dared to for years. Delilah, he said, turning to face her, I've been considering something. She looked up from the curtains she was hemming, her expression curious. What is it? Ethan took a breath, gathering his courage. I think it's time we made this official, the business partnership. We already signed the papers with the bank. No, he said, moving closer to her. Us, our partnership. Understanding dawned in her eyes. Ethan Ingram, are you proposing to me in our unfinished dining room surrounded by sawdust and paint fumes? He hadn't planned this moment, hadn't even fully realized his intention until the words were forming on his tongue, but suddenly it seemed right, perfect even. I am, he confirmed, taking her hands in his. I love you, Delilah. You found me when I was lost and gave me reason to live again. I want to build a life with you if you'll have me. Delilah's eyes filled with tears, but her smile was radiant. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I'll have you. He kissed her then, holding her close as if she might disappear if he let go. When they parted, she laughed softly. Mrs. Whitaker will be scandalized. We're unchaperoned in here. We could wait, do this properly with a ring, and no, she interrupted. This is perfect. This is us. She gestured to the room around them, building something together from the ground up. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church on the edge of town. The ceremony was simple, but well attended. It seemed all of Whispering Pines wanted to witness the union of the taciturn cowboy and the determined widow who had found love in unlikely circumstances. Delilah wore a new dress of pale blue with Ethan's silver hairpin securing her veil. Ethan, uncomfortable in a borrowed suit but handsome nonetheless, stood tall beside her as they spoke their vows. Never thought I'd see the day, Mr. Preston remarked to Mr. Holbrook as they watched the couple exit the church amid a shower of rice and well wishes. Remember when she first came to town, so fierce and independent? Still is, Mr. Holbrook replied. But now she's got someone who appreciates that about her. The celebration continued at Jenkins' home kitchen, renamed Ingram's Home Kitchen as a wedding gift from Ethan to Delilah. The newly expanded dining room was filled with friends and neighbors, all enjoying a feast prepared by Delilah with help from several women of the town who had insisted she not cook on her wedding day. Sheriff Miller raised a toast to the couple. To Ethan and Delilah Ingram, may your home be as warm and welcoming as the eatery you've built together. Ethan, never comfortable with public attention, nevertheless felt a surge of pride as he stood with his arm around his wife, accepting the good wishes of the community that had become his own. Later that night, after the last guest had departed and they were alone in the rooms above the eatery, now their shared home, Ethan took Delilah in his arms and marveled at the journey that had brought them together. Happy? She asked, looking up at him with eyes still bright from the day's joy. More than I ever thought possible, he admitted. I came to this town with nothing but shadows following me. Now I have everything. Not everything, she said with a mysterious smile. Life has a way of offering new surprises. As spring turned to summer and summer to fall, the rhythms of their life together settled into a comfortable pattern. They rose early to prepare the eatery, worked side by side throughout the day, and spent their evenings either entertaining friends or enjoying quiet moments alone. The business prospered. Whispering Pines continued to grow, and Ingram's home kitchen became something of an institution, a place known for good food, fair prices, and the steady presence of its owners. Ethan found peace in the routine and joy in his marriage. Delilah was his partner in every sense, challenging him when he retreated into silence, supporting him when memories of the past threatened to overwhelm him, and loving him with a constancy that still sometimes left him breathless. In October, a year after their first meeting, Delilah confirmed what Ethan had begun to suspect. They were going to have a child. Are you certain? He asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. Quite certain, she replied, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. Doctor Wilson says the baby should arrive in late spring. Ethan was overcome with a mixture of joy and fear. The prospect of fatherhood was both exhilarating and terrifying. His own father had been a distant figure, and Ethan had few models for the kind of parent he wished to be. "I don't know if I'll be good at this," he confessed that night as they lay in bed, his hand gently covering hers over the place where their child grew. "You don't have to know yet," Delilah said softly. "We'll learn together." As Delilah's pregnancy progressed, the town rallied around them. Women brought gifts of handmade baby clothes and blankets, while men offered to take on additional duties at the eatery to spare Delilah from standing too long. Even Sheriff Miller, now a close friend, spent hours crafting a wooden cradle for the expected child. Winter came again to Whispering Pines, but this time Ethan welcomed it. The cold months meant more customers seeking warm meals, and the eatery was often full from opening until closing. They hired additional help, a young widow named Sarah who had a talent for baking, and her brother Thomas, who proved adept at managing the increasingly complex supply orders. On Christmas Eve, exactly 1 year after they had exchanged their first gifts, Ethan presented Delilah with a rocking chair, lovingly made by his own hands under the guidance of the town's carpenter. "For when the baby comes," he explained as she ran her hands over the smooth wood. "It's beautiful," she said, her eyes filling with tears that came more easily these days. "When did you find time to make this?" "Early mornings, before you woke." He helped her sit in the chair, watching as she tested its gentle motion. "I wanted it to be perfect. It is perfect." "Everything is perfect." She looked up at him, her face glowing with happiness. "Do you remember that first night when you sat alone at that empty table and I brought you soup and stayed?" he added. "That was the important part," she smiled. "I knew even then, somehow, that you were someone worth staying for." Ethan knelt beside the rocker, placing his hand on her rounded belly. "I never thanked you properly for that, for seeing something in me worth saving." "You thank me every day," she said, covering his hand with her own. "By being the man I always knew you could be." As they sat together on that snowy Christmas Eve, the fire crackling in the hearth and their child stirring beneath their joined hands, Ethan reflected on the strange and wonderful path that had led him to this moment. From the horrors of Antelope Ridge to the peace of Whispering Pines, from solitude to family, from despair to hope, the future stretched before them, full of promise and possibility. There would be challenges, of course, the baby's arrival, the continued growth of the business, the inevitable moments when the past reached out to remind him of its presence. But for the first time in years, Ethan faced that future with confidence rather than dread. He had found his home, not in a place but in a person. In Delilah, who had placed a bowl of soup before a silent, broken man and then stayed to help him rebuild his life piece by piece. In their shared work and dreams. In the love that had grown between them, as steady and nourishing as the meals they served to their community day after day. And now that home would expand to include a child, a new life untouched by the sorrows of the past. A chance to create something truly good from the ashes of all that had been lost. Outside, snow fell on Whispering Pines, and inside Ingram's home kitchen, a family waited for spring. When May arrived, bringing with it wildflowers and warm breezes, Delilah went into labor. The birth was difficult and long, lasting through a day and night that seemed endless to Ethan as he paced outside their bedroom, barred from entry by the midwife and Dr. Wilson. "This is normal," Sarah assured him, bringing coffee and trying to distract him with talk of the eatery, which she and Thomas were managing in the owner's absence. First babies often take their time, but Ethan could not be comforted. Every cry from behind the closed door sent a spike of fear through him. He had faced death on battlefields and survived the massacre at Antelope Ridge, but nothing had prepared him for the helplessness he felt as Delilah fought to bring their child into the world. Finally, as dawn broke on the second day, a new sound filled the house, the lusty cry of a newborn. Dr. Wilson emerged from the bedroom, tired but smiling. "Congratulations, Mr. Ingram," he said, clapping Ethan on the shoulder. "You have a daughter, a strong, healthy girl." "And Delilah." Exhausted but well, you can go in now. Ethan entered the bedroom with trepidation, unprepared for the sight that greeted him. Delilah, pale but radiant, sat propped against pillows, a small bundle cradled in her arms. She looked up as he approached, her smile weary but triumphant. "Come meet your daughter," she said softly. He sat carefully on the edge of the bed, peering at the tiny face nestled in blankets. The baby had a shock of dark hair and skin that was still red and wrinkled from birth, but to Ethan, she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "Would you like to hold her?" Delilah asked. Ethan hesitated, suddenly aware of how large and rough his hands were, how delicate and perfect this new life seemed. But the desire to hold his child was overwhelming. "Yes," he whispered. Delilah carefully transferred the baby to his arms, showing him how to support her head. The weight of her was almost nothing, yet Ethan felt as if he held the entire world. The baby's eyes opened briefly blue, as all newborns' eyes are, though Ethan wondered if they would stay that way or darken to match Delilah's brown ones. Her tiny hand escaped the blanket and found his finger, gripping it with surprising strength. "She knows her father," Delilah said, watching them with love. "What shall we call her?" Ethan asked, unable to take his eyes off his daughter's face. "I was thinking of Eleanor, after my mother, Eleanor Ingram." He tested the name, finding it strong and beautiful, like the woman who had given it to her. "It's perfect." The first weeks of Eleanor's life passed in a blur of sleepless nights and joyful discoveries. Ethan, who had once faced death without flinching, found himself anxiously checking that his daughter was breathing as she slept. Delilah, usually so confident, sought reassurance that she was nursing properly, that the baby was gaining weight, that everything was as it should be. But amid the anxiety and exhaustion, there was wonder. Eleanor's first real smile, directed at Ethan as he sang to her in the pre-dawn hours. The way her entire body relaxed when Delilah held her close. The perfect miniature of her fingers and toes, which Ethan counted obsessively, marveling at their completeness. The eatery reopened 2 weeks after Eleanor's birth, with Delilah supervising while Sarah and Thomas handled the bulk of the work. Ethan divided his time between helping at the eatery and caring for Delilah and the baby, learning to change diapers and walk the floors with a fussing infant with the same determination he had once applied to military strategy. News of Eleanor's arrival brought a steady stream of visitors bearing gifts and advice. Mr. Preston's granddaughters knitted tiny caps and booties. Sheriff Miller's wife brought a quilt she had been working on for months. Even the cowboys who passed through town left small tokens, a silver dollar for her dowry, a tiny carved wooden horse, a ribbon from a far-off city. As summer settled over Whispering Pines, life found a new rhythm. Eleanor grew stronger each day, her personality emerging in small but distinct ways. She was a serious baby, watching the world with intent eyes, but her smiles, when they came, transformed her face with joy. She had Ethan's dark hair and Delilah's determined chin, a physical manifestation of the union of their strengths. The eatery continued to prosper under their joint management. With Sarah and Thomas now permanent employees, Delilah was able to spend more time with Eleanor while still overseeing the business she had built. Ethan found himself taking on more responsibility, no longer just an employee but a true partner in the enterprise. One evening in late August, as they sat on the small porch behind the eatery, watching the sunset with Eleanor sleeping in Delilah's arms, Ethan reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. "I never imagined this," he said quietly. "Any of it." Delilah looked at him questioningly. "When I rode into Whispering Pines, I was just looking for a place to wait out the winter. I had no plans beyond that." He reached over to touch Eleanor's cheek. "I certainly never expected a wife, a child, a business. Do you regret it?" Delilah asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer, not for a moment. He moved closer, putting his arm around her shoulders. "I was dead inside when I came here. You brought me back to life." "We brought each other back," she corrected gently. I was surviving before you came, but not truly living." They sat in companionable silence, watching as the last light faded from the sky and stars began to appear. Elinor stirred in her sleep, making the small sounds that they had learned to recognize as dreams. "What do you think she dreams about?" Ethan wondered. "Milk, probably," Delilah laughed softly, "or the faces of the people who love her." "I hope her dreams are always peaceful." Delilah leaned her head against his shoulder. "We can't protect her from everything, Ethan. Life will bring its sorrows no matter how much we wish otherwise." "I know." And he did know better than most how quickly happiness could turn to tragedy. "But we can give her this. A home filled with love, a community that values her, parents who will stand beside her no matter what comes." "Yes," Delilah agreed. "We can give her that." As autumn returned to Whispering Pines, bringing with it the anniversary of Ethan and Delilah's first meeting, the town organized a harvest festival. Tables were set up along Main Street, decorated with autumn leaves and pumpkins. Each family brought dishes to share, and musicians played lively tunes for dancing. Ingram's home kitchen contributed pies apple, pumpkin, and berry along with loaves of fresh bread and a giant pot of Delilah's famous stew. Ethan, once so uncomfortable in crowds, found himself at ease among the townspeople who had become friends and neighbors. He held Elinor, now 5 months old and fascinated by the colors and sounds around her, while Delilah served food and chatted with the women of the town. "Never thought I'd see Ethan Ingram as a family man," Sheriff Miller remarked as he joined Ethan at one of the tables. "Suits you, though." Ethan nodded, watching as Elinor reached for a bright leaf dangling from the table decoration. "She changes everything." "Children do that," the sheriff agreed. "Make you see the world differently." As the afternoon wore on, Elinor grew tired and fussy. Ethan took her back to the eatery, settling her in the cradle in their living quarters while Delilah remained at the festival. He sat in the rocking chair beside the cradle, watching his daughter sleep, marveling at the perfect trust she placed in him. The journal Delilah had given him last Christmas sat on a nearby table. Ethan picked it up, opening to a blank page. He had been writing more frequently since Elinor's birth, wanting to preserve memories of these precious early days. But today, he felt compelled to write something different. "My dearest Elinor," he began, the pen flowing smoothly across the paper. "Today is the Harvest Festival, your first though you will not remember it. As I watch you sleep, I find myself thinking of the future, your future, and all that I hope for you." He wrote of his wishes for her. Strength tempered with kindness, courage balanced by wisdom, a life filled with love and purpose. He wrote of the legacy he hoped to leave her, not material wealth, but a name she could be proud of, a family business built on hard work and integrity, a community that would support her as it had supported her parents. And he wrote of the past, not dwelling on its darkness but acknowledging its role in shaping the man who became her father. "Before you were born, before I met your mother, I was lost," he confessed to the page. "I had seen terrible things and carried burdens that nearly crushed me. I tell you this not to sadden you, but to help you understand. It is possible to find light again, even in the deepest darkness. Your mother taught me that, and you, my beautiful daughter, are living proof of it." When Delilah returned from the festival, she found Ethan and Elinor still in the rocking chair, both asleep. The journal lay open on his lap, and she carefully removed it, her eyes catching fragments of what he had written. She did not read it fully. Those words were for Elinor, but what she glimpsed brought tears to her eyes. She covered them with a blanket and moved quietly to the window, watching as lanterns were lit along Main Street for the evening's continuation of the festival. From here, she could see the whole of Whispering Pines, the church spire, the general store, the sheriff's office, and the homes of people who had become dear to her. This was home now, in a way no place had been before. Not because of the buildings or the business she had built, but because of the people she loved. Ethan, whose quiet strength had become her foundation, Elinor, whose existence was a daily miracle, and the community that had embraced them all. As winter approached again, bringing with it the second Christmas that Ethan and Delilah would celebrate together. And Aliner's first Delilah found herself reflecting on that night a year ago when a silent cowboy had sat at an empty table in her eatery, his eyes haunted and his shoulders bowed with invisible weight. She had placed soup before him and stayed, an impulsive act born of compassion, and perhaps a recognition of something in him that called to something in her. She could not have known then how that simple act would change her life, bringing her a husband whose love was as steadfast as it was profound, a daughter who filled her days with joy, and a sense of completeness she had never thought to find. The eatery had closed early that evening in preparation for Christmas the next day. As Delilah nursed Aliner before bed, she heard Ethan moving about in the front room, the soft sounds of his footsteps familiar and comforting. When she emerged, Aliner asleep in her arms, she found the table set with candles and 2 bowls of steaming soup. Ethan stood beside it, his expression a mixture of tenderness and mischief. "What's this?" she asked, carefully placing Aliner in her cradle. "Sit," he said, pulling out a chair for her. Delilah complied, watching as Ethan took the seat across from her. The soup was the same beef and vegetable recipe she had served him that first night, the aroma bringing back memories of their beginning. "1 year ago," Ethan said, his voice low and intense, "a remarkable woman brought soup to a broken man and stayed long enough to save his life, though she didn't know it then." Delilah felt tears welling in her eyes. "Ethan, let me finish," he said gently. "That woman saw something in me that I had forgotten existed. She offered not just food but understanding, not just work but purpose. She gave me a reason to live when I had all but given up." He reached across the table, taking her hands in his. "I love you, Delilah Ingram. I loved you when you placed that first bowl of soup before me, though I didn't recognize it then. I've loved you through every moment since, and I will love you for all the days to come." Delilah, never at a loss for words, found herself speechless. Instead, she rose from her chair, moved around the table, and kissed her husband with all the emotion she could not express. When they parted, Ethan smiled that rare, full smile that transformed his face and reminded Delilah of how far he had come from the grim, silent man who had first entered her eatery. "The soup will get cold," he murmured. "Let it," she replied, pulling him close again. "Some things are more important than soup." Outside, snow began to fall on whispering pines, covering the town in a fresh blanket of white. Inside Ingram's home kitchen, a family built on an unlikely meeting celebrated the miracle of their life together, a life that had begun with a silent cowboy, an empty table, a bowl of soup, and a woman who had the courage to stay.